every single issue that's important to us as Americans gets corrupted by the way we fund campaigns. Now, the problem is the money's not coming from the average American. It's not like all of us are giving money to these candidates. Instead, they're raising this money from the tiniest fraction of the 1%.
American politics have fundamentally changed over the last 14 years.
One reason, in a word, money.
This is going to be the most expensive election year ever.
Super PACs can raise an unlimited sum of money with very few restrictions.
They're like these breathing monsters inside Congress right now.
It's like poison, right? It's like a drop of poison in the well.
Many people don't remember that until 2010, the Republican Party had a very aggressive climate change platform.
Who believes global climate change is serious?
I believe that global climate change
is real, and I've been involved in it.
But in 2010, a pair of court rulings legalized the Super PAC, a vehicle for corporations and billionaires to pour unlimited money into elections.
And almost overnight, the Republican Party went from a party trying to address a very difficult problem in good faith in competition with the Democrats to a party that denied there was even such a thing as climate change.
I do not think the science clearly supports the global warming theory.
With the global warming and that, a lot of it's a hoax. It's a hoax.
Politicians have to pay attention and have to do what the big money wants.
But now, super PACs have a new challenger, a group in Maine with a radical idea.
When I first heard this theory, I did not think it was plausible.
There are some powerful politicians and special interests that don't want to see this come to fruition.
They have a plan to use the very decision that broke our system to fix it. To understand how that's even possible, we have to dive deep into the system that has enabled money to corrupt our politics for the past 40 years. It starts at
the Senate Watergate hearings
and the departure from political life of Richard M. Nixon.
I shall resign the presidency effective at noon tomorrow.
The Watergate scandal prompted an investigation into Nixon's re-election campaign.
American Airlines has admitted it made illegal corporate contributions to President Nixon's re-election campaign.
Nixon was very focused on winning, not just in a small way, but in a dramatic way. And he began to adopt policies which really astonished the public. There's a famous example of a bunch of milk producers who were upset with milk price controls.
These milk producers met with Nixon and illegally offered $2 million to help his re-election campaign.
And surprise, surprise, within a very short period of time, Nixon announced his change in his policy about milk price regulation.
Revelations about this kind of corruption prompted a reckoning. In 1974, Congress amended the Federal Election Campaign Act to include strict limits on donations and cap spending in elections.
So this architecture gets built post-Watergate and immediately challenged, goes to the Supreme Court.
One of the key things the Supreme Court kept was limits on donations.
In Buckley, the Supreme Court said, well, it's okay to limit contributions to a campaign because the fear is there'll be some quid pro quo bribery.
So quid pro quo, as it's currently understood, is a this for a that, a favor in exchange for some kind of governmental action. So the reason we have limits on how much you can contribute to a candidate is because if you could give $20,000 to a candidate, the risk of quid pro quo corruption would be greater.
But the Supreme Court overturned the limits on what campaigns and outside groups could spend in an election. This meant that while an individual could only donate up to $1,000 to a candidate, the candidate and their campaign could spend as much as they wanted.
As somebody once described it, it's like, well, you've got an ocean you can fill and you've got a teaspoon to fill it with. So what it did is it created this really horrific incentive, which is every candidate started to spend all their time fundraising.
Money talks in politics, and on any given evening in Washington, someone is raising money for a campaign.
But there were still some rules. Crucially, politicians were not allowed to accept money from corporations, a rule put in place all the way back in 1907. And in 2002, Congress passed a law to prevent corporations from spending money to try and influence the outcome of an election. That was the case all the way until 2010.
Tonight, as promised, a special comment on the Supreme Court's ruling today in the case Citizens United v. Federal Election Commission.
What Citizens United did is say that corporations could not be limited in spending as much money as they wanted to in the context of a political election. And that's a big deal.
In short, there are now no checks on the ability of corporations or unions or other giant aggregations of power to decide our elections.
There was just one caveat. The spending had to be independent of a campaign. The court still wanted to prevent quid pro quo bribery. So a company could buy ads in a newspaper to promote a candidate, but it couldn't give money directly to a candidate. Still, one key question remained unanswered.
Could you give unlimited amounts of money to a committee that's going to spend money independently of a campaign? So it's not about the spending, it's about the contributions.
2 months after Citizens United, the DC Circuit Court took a case in which it took Citizens United and interpreted it to mean that any donations to a committee that makes independent expenditures couldn't be limited.
Now, at the time, people didn't care much about the decision. The United States government decided not to appeal it to the United States Supreme Court because they didn't think it was going to be significant. But this turned out to be the camel's nose under the tent.
And that decision, not Citizens United, the Speech Now decision, is what led to the absolute profusion of super PACs.
The political ads are coming at us fast and furiously.
Kamala Harris and Joe Biden have been taking us for a ride.
Secretive new breed of spending groups.
Kamala took $2 gas and made it sick.
Trump fights for billionaires like him.
So very quickly, people started using super PACs as the way to dump ungodly large amounts of money into the political system. They could coordinate more effectively as a committee spending money than as one, corporation out there putting billboards up or buying ads in the Wall Street Journal.
Since 2010, super PACs have funneled billions of dollars into elections.
Now, a handful of billionaires can contribute hundreds of millions, even $1 billion into an election cycle.
Instead of the category of people who can give between $2,000 and $5,000 running policy, you now have the people in the stratosphere who are totally disconnected from life. The big super PAC donors don't care about public education, basic health care, basic infrastructure. They certainly don't care about sewage systems because they've got their own whole suite of golden toilets in their mansions.
In 2024, 97% of super PAC money comes from just the top 1% of donors.
Billionaire CEO Elon Musk says he will donate to a new super PAC supporting former President Trump. Musk has pledged to donate $45 million a month.
This is just absolutely unheard of amount of money. He doesn't need to have a polite conversation with Trump where he says, I am going to give this to you so long as you support me. He just needs to have the promise or threat of that money, and of course he's going to have an impact on policy.
And I'm for electric cars. I have to be, because Elon endorsed me very strongly, Elon. So I have no choice.
But according to the DC Circuit Court decision that came right after Citizens United, independent donations, no matter what size, couldn't be classified as bribery because there was no direct relationship between the donor and the candidate, at least in theory.
The decision that gave us super PACs is just wrong. It's just obviously, logically wrong. Take the case of Robert Menendez. Menendez was indicted for bribery. He was indicted, the charge was, he promised to give government favors in exchange for money from a Florida billionaire. But the Florida billionaire was not giving Menendez's the money, wasn't giving Menendez's campaign the money. He was giving the money to Menendez's super PAC. So there we have quid pro quo bribery. involving a contribution to a super PAC. The very thing that the DC Circuit said could not happen was what was indicted in the Menendez case.
It's obvious that a major contribution to a super PAC is going to influence a candidate. It takes incredible gymnastics and just an ignorance of basic human nature that any 6-year-old knows to think that it wouldn't influence candidates.
See, Citizens United actually left a key way to regulate political contributions.
So what the Supreme Court has said is if there is a significant risk of what it calls quid pro quo corruption, you can regulate it. In the case of super PACs, there is an extremely significant risk of quid pro quo corruption, so we can regulate it.
And now a policy to curb the unchecked power of billionaires and corporations is on the ballot in Maine.
It's a very short question on the ballot. Do you want to limit to $5,000 the amount that a political action committee can accept from an individual or corporation?
The argument is not that we're trying to suppress the amount of money in politics. We're trying to avoid raising money in a way that creates the risk of quid pro quo corruption. If 1 million people give $100 to a particular PAC, that's $100 million. That's a lot of money. And that PAC will have an extraordinary influence in the political process. But it's an influence that reflects the popularity of its ideas across a wide range of the public. That's how democracy is supposed to work.
Their idea has gotten support from people across the political spectrum.
One of the first people to sign it was the chairman of the local Trump campaign, who was there himself to gather signatures to get Donald Trump's name on the primary ballot. And he looked at it and he said, hell yes, and he signed it. And then he got everybody who signed his petition to come over and sign my petition to get the initiative on the ballot.
If the ballot initiative passes on November 5th, it will be challenged in the courts, because it's in direct conflict with the current rule from the DC Circuit Court that corporations and individuals have a right to contribute unlimited money to super PACs. But this legal battle is actually what Mainers are hoping for.
If it's challenged, it will then go to a court that's never considered the question, the First Circuit Court of Appeals. If that court says super PACs can be regulated, then it will get to the United States Supreme Court.
This sets the Supreme Court up to decide if unlimited donations to super PACs create a risk of quid pro quo and should be regulated.
So the argument that Maine will be making to the Chief Justice is we want you to apply your principle to a set of facts you've never considered before. So your principle is you can regulate where there's a risk of quid pro quo corruption. We say there's a risk of quid pro quo corruption, and what's our evidence of that risk? Well, let me show you Robert Menendez. Let me show you the charges against Donald Trump. Let me show you any number of cases where it's absolutely clear that you've got a quid pro quo involving a contribution to a super PAC.
Mainers get off the sofa and take action to do what needs to get done to solve a problem. If a neighbor needs help, you help your neighbor. If there's a problem in your school, you jump up and help the problem in your school. If there's a problem in your democracy because it's not working for you, you get up off the couch and you do something about it. And that's what Mainers have always done.
So they say, as Maine goes, so goes the nation. We've got a shot. Let's take it.
Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe to see more videos like this one. And if you have ideas for stories you want us to cover next, leave them in the comments.